Everyone. Hello, everyone. This is the second online lecture of our Global South and East Thematic Group on International Planning Education. Paulo Silva is the speaker. He is the AESOP representative to JPN and JPN Vice Chair. We already had our first lecture on conceptualizing Global South, and the next one will be in mid-May on publication from the South. Over to you, Paulo.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invite. It's a pleasure to participate in this initiative from the thematic group and to share with you what has been my interest and my experience, especially since I took this position in 2019, in fact, as representative of AESOP in JPN. So I added some subtitle to the suggested title of my presentation, International Planning Education in the Global Setting. The structure of my presentation will follow this sequence. I'm going to start by give some general ideas of what was the provocation to this presentation. It was mainly to do with the mismatch between what both sides of this global context think of what planning and planning education, but also planning practice should be on both sides, and looking at the other side. So what global North planners think that are the needs of global South planning, but also what are global South planners' expectations in relation with the global North. I start this with my background. I've been before I was more engaged into this topic of this discussion. I started my work and my research in informality some years ago, and that started by being research, doing where I'm based in Portugal, but soon after, it took me away from Europe, and it took me away from this regional context and to other contexts, in particular to Southeast Asia, where I've been engaged into international planning studios. And in addition to that, my participation, my small contribution to the excellence in education board of AESOP that defines or engages in a process of quality recognition of planning programs in Europe, mainly from the AESOP members, has made me reflect about some qualities that planning education could have or should have, and that I will also extend more while during this presentation. So I will start really by addressing doing some reflections on the Global South aspects that, for me, I found them quite crucial to this discussion, to this presentation. First of all, where do we come from? Globalization is a part of this process that starts with Industrial Revolution and that established these empires centered in the industrialized countries in order to what we all know to get on one hand access to raw materials, but that was the immediate reason. But attached to this came the development of a solid bureaucratic public administration that would allow to control these huge territories. This map from 1914, the year of the First World War, shows how these huge blocks were distributed in the different continents and the different world regions. And planning is not detached from this. I mean, it was mainly the pressure of the negative outcomes of the Industrial Revolution that made really planning to emerge as an autonomous discipline from others, and more than one century ago. And soon after the Second World War, with the growth of many aspects in Europe and the United States, not only demographic, but also in terms of wealth, also increased the demand, the collective demand for better rights and social conditions for this working class that was supporting the economy of these empires that were not anymore there. The colonies were getting were slowly being reaching independence. And from that independence, we moved from this colonial world to a megacity world, to this megacity world that started with that process of the independence of the former colonies, but where these new countries emerge, in which the interest of the industrial powers in the world would not give away. So they were still securing their connection with these former colonies and securing their good access to the raw materials that were still needed. And while they moved there, while this independence was achieved, soon most of the especially European but also North American companies realized that the social rights in those new countries were not so were more affordable than in the rich and developed countries of and regions of Europe and Northern America. So the topic of the share of responsibilities between public and private sectors on one hand made on one hand national governments weaker, and on the other hand, with these new governance arrangements that emerged in the 1980s, the globalization of economy, which was a box full of new possibilities, but also of new risks. And as we can see from this list of largest cities in the world, many of them belong to these emergent regions of previous colonies from these countries, and they create this constellation in which national borders are not so relevant anymore. So if this caused, in one hand, a great change in the global south, it has also a huge impact in the global north. And this idyllic image of a previous industrial area in Germany was not reached without some trouble in the meantime, because this implied radical rearrangements of productive structures at global scale. So many jobs were lost in the former industrial powers, and they were transferred to, and let's use this expression, global south, as a way to describe the place where these industries and these productive structures moved away to. Attached to this we assisted to a rural-urban migrations at national scale from informal colonies and beyond. So we know the numbers show that our population is getting more and more urban, but that was quite radical within the global South, and not to be underestimated also in these migration movements between global South and global North. As a result of that, as we can see, the structure of the population and the distribution of the rank of cities with larger amounts of population and also the urban land cover in these four regions show how different they are still, despite these huge changes. What is interesting to see is that we continue looking at these world regions separately, as if they are, although we know that they are the result of a global phenomena of a liberal and global market in which economic relations between countries tend to be more and more open, at least until the recent times. We still look then at the effects of that at regional scale and moreover at national scale. Well, these are just some of the impacts of that affects our territories nowadays. And here I bring one of our publications from AESOP, from the Transactions of AESOP journal, and this article, this paper from Rachel Alterman draws attention on the fact that we will have to learn how to transfer knowledge across national and continental borders in a manner that would fit local needs, which means borders are still there, but we have to know what are the needs that we can make that can help to circulate knowledge across different parts of the world. This globalization process also affected how we perceived academia and how we perceived our communities. And if the 70s and 80s were the consolidation of the regional perception of some communities, such as the European academic community in planning, well, AESOP was exactly created in the 1980s. It was linked, or at least associated, with this globalization process that in 2001, GPAN was created with the initiative of four planning associations from 4 different regions in the world that decided to organize the first World Planning Schools Congress in 2001 in Shanghai, in which they also established and they signed and they compromised with a Shanghai Statement in which they committed to promote planning education in global terms and to engage in organizing the second World Planning Schools Congress. And starting from there, quite quickly, rapidly, this network became bigger and reached the number of associations that we have nowadays, which are here described. I have this updated collection of data of the number of school members of each one of the 11 associations. What I would like to underline here is that while, for instance, the most populated are the North American Association and also the European Association, that also counts with corresponding members that are not necessarily from Europe. They are, in this case, mainly from the USA and Middle East, and they are these 16 affiliate members. Other associations have a predominance of a specific region, such as Latin American Association, where Mexico concentrates the most of the schools that make part of this association. So they have different criteria from world regions to countries, even to languages, such as the APERO, the French-speaking association. And what we see here is also the discrepancy between the coverage of each association and the number of schools. For instance, the African Association counts with 36 schools, while, for instance, the Brazilian Association counts with 52 school members. All these numbers are quite updated, and of course there are different cultures of planning cultures embedded in here. For instance, some of these associations have mainly very pure, so-called pure planning programs, while others, like the Brazilian Association, tends to have more training or teaching in the education in planning attached with architecture programs. This is a map, a diagram or a table that I did to show to my colleagues in EXCO in AESOP how we are organized. So GPIN is composed by the 11 association. It has two main bodies, and these bodies interact with this goal of making planning education globally discussed with some key partners with which we have some kind of more or less established relations, like the UN Habitat, the Global Planners Network, AESOCARP, and Commonwealth Association of Planners. And also we engage in quite a number of activities and that are launched more or less regularly and with different rhythms. So from these early years of 2001, in which it was even that started before that, the stage of forming, we are EGPIN is clearly in a phase of performing, in which many of these activities take place from the World Planning Schools. We are now preparing the launch of the call for the 6th World Planning School Congress, after having them in Shanghai, in Mexico City, in Perth, and Rio, and last year in Bali. So the next year the next one will take place in 2026. But we also have a very active presence in World Urban Forum, in the series of Urban Thinkers campuses, on the activities of Planners for Climate Action, and also on issuing regular publication of dialogues in regional and urban planning, as well as other UN Habitat initiatives such as World Urban Campaign. And this is probably one example that gathers all these networks and initiatives and together, in which we see from the structures from UN Habitat to GPIN to some associations and some universities. And well, just to highlight one of what has been our work in these last years, one of our key moments of our work is the participation in the World Urban Forum. Well, since I'm very honored to be in this position. I already had a chance to work and to contribute to two of these World Urban Forum. The first one in 2020 in Abu Dhabi, and the last one in Katowice last year. And during these events, this GPIN networking event, which joint GPIN invites guests and also speakers from UN Habitat and Habitat Uni. There was the opportunity to showcase very interesting examples of good practices in knowledge-based partnerships. And these are just highlights of what was discussed, for instance, from developing cooperative teaching programs of PhD studies and research between African universities and one German university to cooperation in the sub-Saharan region, providing training and technical assistance to local governments, tools and knowledge, involving 2 African universities and also American universities, but also to support international agencies in improving policies and advocacy. So this shows how in a broader sense the universities are engaged and can be engaged in cooperating beyond borders and cooperating between different regions. Also, the recent pandemic showed how online education was relevant. So the contribution here of our colleague Roberto Rocco from TU Delft was very interesting on highlighting that. So that showed how the potential is there for partnerships from universities worldwide on one hand, and how other institutions can benefit and can also support and be supported by universities. And the main goal of this was to show the opportunity that existed to the cooperation between university, academia, and UN Habitat, especially within Habitat Uni, which is the interface of UN Habitat with academia. But also showed us that in all these 4 examples, we were talking about cooperation in one single direction, from the global north to the global south. So what does research shows us in terms of international planning education? I will start by explaining here some ideas that were taken from this paper published on students' mobility, transnational student mobility, and that shows how there are different factors that influence the mobility of students worldwide. And one of them is, of course, the instability of institutions in their own home countries. And this map shows this difference. And when we see the brighter colors, which reveals the more stable institutions, and the darker colors, which reveals those parts of regions where this instability of institutions is bigger, we can see a strong relation with the directions in which mobility of students occur. This was one of the factors highlighted by the authors in this research, but 2 other factors was the homophily of students regarding specific regions of the world. So this, which has to do with the reputation of higher education institutions. This is not planning institutions only, is higher education institutions in general, but also having to do with the recognition of the reputation of the institutions to where this mobility is directed to. So in this case, the authors highlight the fact that Great Britain has been a long player in these dynamics, and especially anchored in the Commonwealth countries, which bring us back to one of the early slides in which it was very present, the colonial setting and the post-colonial setting, but also other regions like China, in which this presence was not so strong as in the Commonwealth countries. On the other hand, shows other clusters, such as the Germany cluster, the Italy cluster, and the France cluster as a very consistent concentrations of institutions that attract students from many different parts of the world, attracting international students. Well, in which language plays a strong role, but not only. And finally, the third group that is highlighted here is a group of other very powerful regions in the world or countries that are responsible for attracting a huge number of students. Australia, having working as a centrality, especially for Southeast Asian countries. USA with Latin American countries, and Canada, and Canada with Caribbean countries as well. And also, well, and then shows how other smaller groups are clustered among. But when the researchers looked beyond the countries and looked for former colonial ties between those countries, the results are also very interesting. It shows a clear separation of clusters between them, and the biggest ones are here very clearly highlighted: the United Kingdom and then France and Spain as the largest receivers of ties from former colonies, but also it's referred the case of Turkey, that is a huge impact in a number of a relevant number of countries, and this has to do with cultural and political ties from the past, especially due to the relevance of Turkey as siege of the Ottoman Empire, that makes this influence ranging from countries as Armenia, Bulgaria, to Tunisia. But on the other hand, also reveals these clusters in smaller groups for countries like Portugal and Portuguese-speaking new countries, or Germany or Netherlands, which is a very well-known case, for instance, with their links with Indonesia. So this shows that despite the fact that globalization is there, these old ties that were inherited from colonial times are still very present in this interaction between students and institutions. Moreover, we also have to, and the next research reminds us that also this part of this mobility is due to the different positions that countries and academic communities play in the global setting. Ironically, the authors refer that ISM goes for international students mobility. Well, the S could also be for migration. So in many cases, these movements are seen as an opportunity for migration. It means that these investment on education, sometimes, or in a number of times, does not reflect then on the countries of origin, because some of these, or a relevant number of these students, remain in this or in the countries where they got their education, or they tend to move into other worlds, to other world regions in which they found better conditions to practice, to engage either in professional, in practice, or also in academic contexts. And the authors do this remark that in a way this unveils the fact that this new expression Global South, can be eventually considered as a metaphor that replaced the formerly used terms of third world or developing countries in order to avoid discriminating implications, becoming a more neutral designation of the different stages in which the world regions are. Well, during my term as AESOP representative, I was addressed by these colleagues from TU Dortmund because they were doing research on planning programs worldwide, and in relation with climate change and disaster risks. So they addressed me mainly to get contacts with the representatives from other associations. So this is it's nice to see now the result of this connection. So due to get in touch with the different representatives from the different associations present in GPAN, they started exploring the data. They are still in touch with some of the associations, but already they concluded a part of this research, which had in mind the sub-Saharan Africa on one hand and Southeast Asia on the other hand. And also here I highlight some of what were the conclusions that result from analyzing the planning curricula from all the planning courses, from all the different levels, from all the different programs, from bachelor to PhD in these two world regions. So in this they analyzed 53 programs with more than 1,000 courses, in which they found some quite interesting features. One of them was the fact that on one hand, rural, regional and urban planning were very established courses, while rural development or village planning in sub-Saharan Africa were very, very few. So they found almost any evidences of these contents being taught in courses, in planning programs in sub-Saharan Africa. And they suggest this interpretation that these might reflect, on one hand, the colonial approach, which focused on planning interventions in urban areas, in these parts of the region, which left the villages more as a governed parts of the countries. Said that this was something that was very clear on this analysis. On the other hand, they found a very residual number of issues that of courses that cross-cut different issues, and among these issues, which would be possible to find, it could be gender, poverty, informality, or vulnerable groups. And in these cases, they just found 8 courses among more than 1,000 and within 53 programs that had this cross-cutting approach of these issues. And this also refers to the climate change and disaster risks issues that they were not absent from planning. They were not absent from university programs, but they were absent from planning programs, which means that you would find this topic of climate change and disaster risks explicitly associated with programs that are specifically addressed to this issue, but not cross-cutting other planning issues. Yeah, so this was the third big conclusion that they found regarding the analysis of the urban planning courses. And given that they suggested in their discussion of results 3 different possibilities on how to improve this lack of interaction between issues that are still kind of very traditionally separated and not addressed in a different way. So these 3 options that they define as A, B, and C is one that could be the creation of new specialized courses on climate change and disaster management, but also on gender, poverty, and informality. This means that the authors found the need of these courses, but on the other hand, they say, well, given to the limited space that planning programs and the university programs in general have in terms of ECTS, this would make that other issues will be put apart or be excluded due to this limited space of each program. So this was an option that was not clearly taken as a possibility. On the other hand, the possibility of creating new specialized courses, but only at a specific level, especially at the master level, creating options, creating branches of these programs, and including they mentioned one example of this. Finally, the third option regards the inclusion of these topics within existing courses as part of the mandatory as a mandatory part of the course description. Given those 3 options, they raised a very interesting question that says, well, despite the fact of what is the most reasonable one to adopt, of course, B and C seems to be the most reasonable ones. There's still one, but how to do this cross-cutting, how to address these cross-cutting issues when having in mind the profiles of professors and lecturers that are actually teaching students in these universities, which either were trained by traditional in traditional environments and in planning, in which the courses are very well established, like regional and urban planning, planning theory, planning and history theory, etc. But then in which in inclusion, social inclusion, and gender issues were not part of their own training. So how can the academic staff adapt to this? Well, one of the way of this of promoting this adaptation could be to launch new training for these teaching staff. But on the other hand, teaching criteria are much more defined nowadays by labor market rather than by academia needs. So this brings quite of a fresh look of what's happening in specific world regions, and I think this is a very interesting work to follow. I know that they are continuing to do their research with other world regions, and I would move then to what has been my own experiences while working and teaching both now in global north and in global south. And this is due to my background, mainly on informality. This is how I come here, and now my reflections have been through this way into this topic. Well, soon after I participated in 2014 in a UN Habitat conference in Cairo. I get involved with this group of colleagues from these two institutions, the University of Sydney and Institute of Technology of Bandung, that had the aim, and they started exactly after we met in 2015, of creating an immersive context in which students could engage. So students from planning development courses in Australia could engage with students from planning program in Indonesia. And in order to do that, there will be a joint studio, an intensive and immersive environment of 10 days of field work, not just of field work, but also on collecting data and proposing and exposing their ideas and thoughts during those 10 days. So those were really very intense 10 days that had a pre-preparation and a post production, let's say, phase after leaving Indonesia and going back to Australia. And this revealed to be, the focus, this revealed to be a very good opportunity to share different perspectives between students within the same framework. So starting from New Urban Agenda, the SDGs, to see how students look at these from different perspectives and from different needs as well. So the main goal of these joint students has been to expose students to what does New Urban Agenda means in the context of informality, which is probably the most extreme context in any urban setting, either in global north or in global south. This has been the main focus has been in design and in urban design, and also architectural design, or mainly in the interface between public and private spaces, from the informal perspective. And they have been conducted during four seasons in person, then online, hybrid, and then in person again. It will be full in person this year. So the idea that and many authors talk about that, how this pandemic reinforce the use of digital tools for teaching, online teaching, as Roberto Rocco was mentioning of the experience of TU Delft programs during the pandemic, was also very active in this case. But as a matter of fact, we are going back to the in-person. Well, what does this mean? I think it also means that the difference of context between who comes from the global north or who comes from the global south, or who comes from the global south to the global south, the difference of context, sometimes it's so different, it's so extremely different, that this in-person experience is really necessary and it's really fundamental to improve or to the learning process and the educational achievements. And the experience of dealing with these has been very rich in terms of learning from the gaps that exist exactly between the so-called global north and south, but also between urban and rural. So within the same region, within global south regions, with very contrasted codes and attitudes between urban settings and rural settings, and how urban codes overlap, and how formal codes imposed by public administration, inherited from colonial periods, overlap with implicit informal codes. And this is very clear when we talk, and me coming from a Western perspective, which is not so Western because we have a strong Islamic influence in the medieval ages in the place where I'm working and living. Between, for instance, different notions of public space. What does a public space mean in the Islamic context, and what does it mean for the Roman laws that inspired most of the Western legal frameworks for the regulation of places in cities? And just to mention these two and not go into more local backgrounds and more local contexts. So negotiations and processes of interaction, of adaptation are very present, and it has been very rich to fulfill the understanding of these gaps. Because they also are a way of understanding and putting in perspective how planning practice is performed right in nowadays, but how was in the past the regulations within communities, within urban settlements, before the modernistic approach that was implemented and disseminated a bit all over the world. Moving ahead on this notion of what are the critical aspects that are relevant for planning and for teaching, one of the issues that have been more evident, especially in these last years, it has been how complex and non-linear urban developments are and urban evolution is. So just these examples are enough to understand how things move from energy issues in which sometimes we are going in the direction of going more into alternative energies and less polluting sources of energy, when in times of crisis we suddenly go back to fossil and we face again the possibilities of investing in nuclear energy as health issues, settlements issues, climate change, etc., are continuously changing and in a non-linear way. This reveals very much the need of breaking these barriers or these borders between courses, between contents of programs, within the programs, looking for more systemic approaches. It does not make so much sense to deal with informal settlements as such when they are part of the urban setting of a region. And I would dare to say that most of these informal settlements are not, some of them are slums, others are not really slums, well, they have much better condition than some extreme slums. But anyway, being slums, they are not slums of a specific city, they are not slums of a specific region, they are global slums, because in many of these cases, they are the result of all this economic rearrangement that took place in the past decades and made some of what were the problems of informality in the global north being externalized to the global south. So this means we need to look for systemic approaches that allows us to deal and to understand and to deal and to plan within complex contexts, assuming that non-linearity is part of the processes, and also that from small individual actions we can have very unexpected outcomes at the city and beyond the city level. And for that, the processes of co-evolution, the processes of self-organization are very evident examples of that. So we are facing here in a way two main challenges. On one hand, these views are very useful for students which will be hands-on planners, most of them in the future, and they will need to deal much more with this complexity and with this non-linearity. I think to understand these qualities, I think it's even more important than to go into detail into the case studies, because once you are 5-6 years away from your country and then you come back after studying abroad, well, a good number of things might have changed, and in order to grasp that new reality, I think these are very important tools. But also taking care in terms of planning education, taking care of planners as past students and as past planning students, and the need that these planners that are now working in regions in the global south get update on concepts, on acknowledging new societal challenges, and having this broader picture again in the systemic context of what is the reason for what, and how do these different dynamics interact between them, among them. So I will go back to my final slide. I'm also reaching the time of this seminar, just to leave to the debate these few topics. First of all, I think the need is mainly whether the education is performed in the global north or in the global south. I think we all need, since we became part of this global context, to be exposed to this global context. I've been having this experience on getting in touch with some planning programs, mostly in Europe, due to my role in this Excellence in Education Board from AESOP. And we see that in some cases, there's a misunderstanding between what is the global context and what is internationalization of students. What is the difference between going abroad in a study tour or understanding the phenomena that are occurring in another part of the globe as part of our own interaction with that, with all the other world regions. Another key aspect that I would like to underline, and I think it was implicit in the examples I gave, is that we need definitely to not perpetuate post-colonialism, and Global North is struggling to get students and to deal with the demographic crisis. I mean, I'm based in one of the countries with a lower rate of demographic rate in Europe, to say the least. So the demand and the attraction of students from other parts of the world is something that is very present on the policies of our institutions. But this has this risk of perpetuating this post-colonialism. So it's also a challenge for those who are teaching and working in the Global North to deal with that and to work against that. And to remind that there's lots of things, also lessons to be learned, because if something was learned in these last years of crisis, is that resources cannot be taken for granted, and life conditions cannot be taken for granted. In that respect, the Global North can have lots to learn with the Global South in terms of dealing with less resources, being less well-equipped in some cases, but do the same job and be able to perform a planning profession in an equally good way of doing it. A fourth aspect that I would like to highlight would be the aspect of ethics and planning. This is one of the criteria, but being exposed to a context of weak institutions, as one of the previous slides shows, that is very present in these countries, that from which mobility students are from. Ethics, well, ethics is important anywhere in the world, but in particularly when we have ethics institutions, planners are much more vulnerable and much more exposed to pressures, etc. So of course, to teach and to focus on ethics, it's not enough to deal with that, but it's a very important skill for planners to have in any context, and in particularly in contexts in which institutions are weaker. On the fifth place, I would like to refer here and to address the fact that while planning programs became very prominent in the last half of last century in the Global North, and now I know mainly the experience from Europe with the Bologna reform, we've been facing and dealing with the reduction on and of the size and the length of the planning programs, either the master programs and the PhD programs, and in many cases, planning education was disappeared from the bachelor programs. So reducing this is also a way to make planning less relevant, which means that the contents tend to be less developed. So if this is a risk for teaching students from the global north, but also teaching students from the global south. And this is something that is not yet happening in the global south, but the pressure is to do this in the global north. We might expect to occur also in the global south in the future. So it's important to be aware and to try to anticipate that tendency and try to make the planning education stronger in order to avoid that and to be more recognized by society. And finally, I would like to underline how pressures are over planning education due to planning agendas and also to planning financing. This is very evident on the global north. It's very evident in the European Union how the subjects that are addressed in the contents of courses are influenced, are encouraged by the financing that comes from European Union agenda. It's good to have that, but on the other hand, leaves apart some of what should be the result of our reflection of what could be and what should be the profile of planning educators in the future. This happens in the case of Europe, as I said, but it can also happen in the case of Global South, for instance, in countries that are highly financed by other countries, and that can also imply an influence of what are the planning agendas and what are the planning or the pressures over planning programs. And I would stop here. I have a list of some of my references, and I will stop here. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to discuss and to debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulo. Now we can take questions.
Shall I stop sharing?
I think yes. That should be okay. Yeah, Giulio.
Yeah. Hi, Paulo.
Hi,
Thank you very
Giulio.
much. How are you?
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you, and it was great to hear your very comprehensive presentation. And also, it's great to be with all the colleagues here, by the way. Now, I would like to make a comment based on my experience, which in a way is similar to yours. I mean, operating in different contexts and comparing them. In my case, particularly now, after having worked in China for quite a long period in a British university there, which was at some point even, I mean, in that context, accused to be a colonial experiment in a certain way, although I think we tried to contextualize knowledge as much as we could when we were there with colleagues, with Chinese colleagues, and now based in London, which is, as you mentioned, is a sort of hub, which is still attracting students due to also, in a way, the colonial legacy of course, and the historic legacy of the country. But anyway, what I was reflecting on when you were mentioning all these points is the fact that most of the challenge that we are facing in our in knowledge transfer and in the rational knowledge transfer is about often the lack of critical contextualization of what we are providing and thinking about the recipient of our knowledge, which can be international students, which then go back to their countries, or what we have discussed actually. So in terms of planning, I think that in my experience, at least, what I found very important is to allow this critical contextualization to emerge through a number of things. For instance, by focusing on the importance of the political economy of certain contexts and how that relates to planning, to certain aspects of critical development studies, which are linked to the points that you made about poverty, gender, informality, inequality, the complex relationship between the policy making, the institutional challenges of places, and then the plan making and all of that. That requires, in a way, strong, I believe, interdisciplinary, how to say, efforts if we really want to go beyond the traditional planning education, to being able to create that linkages that allow to understand power relationship, different contexts, from not only from the point of view of planning and design, but also from the point of view of other disciplines, if you like. So my point is that, and also my question to you is how much, well, in a way you have responded to that, but how limited is, in a way, our real possibility in planning courses to do that, to achieve that interdisciplinary effort that we would need to really enable this knowledge transfer to take place. And it has to do with the background of staff teaching, I mean, ourselves in a way, to how much we are capable to innovate our practice, to the way in which university recruit, which is always departmental based, disciplinary based, and it's so difficult to get people with different expertise. So how to overcome these challenges? I think it's really something to consider, and I'm not sure how we can do it, because I still see that although we know where we should go, there are really big barriers to achieve that. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, thank you for the comment. It was a pleasure for me, and for me it has been a privilege being AESOP representative and being also myself in contact with experiences like yours in Morocco and Maghreb and in other parts of the country and of the region. And well, I would say that it's not only the students that need to be exposed to the global context. I think we need to be more exposed to the global context. Most of the teaching staff are very comfortable in not being exposed to global context. The careers, the academic careers can be very, how should I say, could not stimulate much this exploratory side of it and the understanding of this global context. And I have to say, I think this is a very important, I think this is a very important aspect that needs to be included. And how much, this is something I always think, how much did I learn from going to Indonesia, from going to Malaysia, from going to other parts, to other world regions, not just sharing my well, the outcomes of my research, but also what can I get from that? That has been very, and my final reflections, I'm sure you have similar experiences. My final reflections on what is a public space that we tend to take for granted. Well, a public space is this, blah, 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 blah. And then you go to the largest Islamic country in the world, where Islamic rules are very well kept. And then you see in these narrow streets of Kampung, you see ladies not wearing the scarf, and you wonder why. Because for them, this is not, they still feel themselves in the domestic sphere, in the private sphere. Although for us as Westerners, or coming from with other cultural background, we look at it as public space. So we expect a certain behavior, which is not the behavior that then we see. So I think we also need to change that. We also need to be exposed to this global context. It is striking a little bit how sometimes it's difficult to talk about this with colleagues, to talk about this, what does it mean to expose to global context, and to see how quite often or sometimes this is mixed with going abroad and learning from some experiences in another country. It's very different. Yeah, global context, in my perspective, means to have a systemic perception. If slums are in some place, this is the equivalent of the slums in European cities, in American cities in the 19th century. They are just more far away, but they are part of the same system. So yeah, this is what I would add to the conversation. Yeah.
I think you're calling on me, Chandrima, but you're muted. I'll go ahead. Paulo, thank you for a wonderful presentation, pulling together many very important threads with, I think, important recommendations. I'm struck by the findings that you reported from the Schultz study that suggests that planning courses are not in the lead in their universities with respect to cross-cutting issues that are central in our times. And they mentioned informality, they mentioned climate change, and other things. I was just at a session where the ACSP Climate Task Force reported out the results of their findings, and they're suggesting that the ACSP schools are moving toward including climate in their curricula. Our accreditation body now requires that climate be considered in every planning curriculum. But they indicate that the vast majority of the schools are doing this as electives, not as part of the mandatory required courses. And the movement is just so incredibly slow. And we've known about, there were key indications of climate change problems 50 years ago, but we certainly know in the last 10 years, and we certainly know in the years since the Paris Accords, how vital climate change education is going to be to planning. And others around us, other disciplines and new fields are moving faster, and our cities are creating new climate offices that are separate from the planning departments. And very often we see a disconnect between the comprehensive plan and the climate plan, where they're not in alignment at all. I guess I'm stumbling here for how can we make this happen faster? And is there perhaps a role for the Global South in taking the lead? We've seen more and more innovations originating in the Global South and then moving later into the Global North in recent years. Do we have the potential that the Global South schools in the South could be the leaders who are going to show the Northern schools how to move forward on issues like climate change and informality? So, thank you.
Well, but particularly speaking of informality and how does this affect, or the way the settlements are affecting the environment, it is clear how some of there's a kind of a path dependency regarding what has been occurring in the Global North. So we see, despite the fact that we learned from what was the way we dealt with slums after the First World War and after the Second World War in Europe, for instance, we see that and knowing what are the damages caused by eviction already from other cases, we still struggle with countries and contexts in which either eviction or upgrading are not working on the same direction. But I agree with you. From my own experience, I see, and with some institutions, including with mine, I mean, we used to have a planning program in connection. We were in the department of environment and planning. So the two disciplines were together. And I think the moment we moved towards political science and we moved towards public policies, we achieved some new knowledge in social sciences, but somehow it was not manageable to cover both the engineering sciences that deal more with environmental issues and the social sciences. So I think the drift that planning programs experienced in the last decades might explain that fact that we are losing our space in dealing in practice with climate change, and we have like environmental engineering and other disciplines much better equipped, sometimes much better equipped than us, because the way our programs evolved to deal with climate change and with climate impacts.
There are two raised hands. I don't know who was first, but Chialin, and then we will check.
No, I think I'm the second.
Okay.
Okay, then I will simply start. Thanks, Paulo, for referring to my study. Actually, it was somehow a research during the COVID-19 lockdown, so what to do. So an online research is always feasible. So the database is based on mid-2020, and obviously I could only include courses or planning schools where the program is available online. Obviously, we considered all courses, including electives, but what we realized is that it takes a long time for a curriculum to be changed or updated. So I know it from a joint master course, which we are running since '84 with university in Kumasi. And in Dortmund, we have changed the program, I think, 3 times already, and with every new accreditation we updated it. And in Kumasi it's still the same on the status of '84, simply because it takes too much time to go all through the procedures at university. So they slot in new topics informally, but it is not mentioned in the curriculum. So that's also something what I highlighted with all the options, whether it's simply better to not to have new programs or new courses, but to slot it in the course description as a way out to avoid a re-accreditation or even the abolishment of courses due to financial constraints. That's all.
Thank you.
Chialin.
Oh, right. Okay. Hi, Paulo. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoy it, and I think I really agree with you that in terms of the South-South transfer exchanges, and then how the global South is supposed to be able to also have some experiences for the North to learn. And I personally am coming from Taiwan, and I also had experiences teaching in SJTOU, which Julio was working there for 4 years, and I was there for 3 years. So I'm teaching now in the UK, Liverpool. So kind of I'm from global North, I'm from global East, if you like. It's actually the South East Asia is not really classified as global South, and then work in global South, and then now working in global North. And what I found is really interesting and also a bit frustrated is that the current situation, the energy crisis or whatever, and there's sort of a lot of places in the global north also struggling. And so what I want to know, and also in terms of for the future as well, I think a lot of advances is made in global south because they are more, they are developing, they are much faster in the pace and much faster in the global north. And of course, there are a lot of ethics or a lot of foundation has been built in global north. So, but I think a lot of those things also need to be done in change in global north. Is kind of in terms of digitalization or a lot of new development in the past few years, in particular after COVID. I think technology has been really make it very accessible for everyone across the world to be able to know the knowledge. You don't need to really come to a global north to learn. You can be just based in where you are. And even in global north, you are more flexible, be wherever you are. So I just want to know your view. And what do you think about global north? What should I change? It's not really about global south should do. It's actually also about global north. And because I've been thinking about these questions based on my background, and so I just want to hear what do you think, and many others as well, audience, the colleagues also, it will be interesting to know.
Well, I think in the global north, well, from the experience I have from AESOP mainly, it's from the programs in European schools. I see that there's an effort. There are very interesting examples of programs being launched for international development. For instance, Politecnico Milano has a very interesting oriented master program on international planning, and shows that openness to learn with the others. But I still see that as not so much as a process to learn to yourself, to take lessons from that, to be in a global north institution learning from global south, taking advantage from there's lots of efforts being put on inclusiveness, on receiving students from all over the world, involving students with different experiences, with different backgrounds, with different cultural also profiles into the programs, including their experiences there. But I don't see much of learning from that. Of that interchange changes the way the institutions teach planning to their own students and to their own regional setting. So it's something that, yeah, it's interesting because it's like a tunnel effect between global north and global south communication that does not have a direct effect on what's happening in the global north. That is my feeling that occurs. And maybe this has to do with the fact that despite the fact that that usually that openness exists, but on the other hand, there's the knowledge transfer works much more on the north to south direction rather than the other way, and very little or much less in the other way around.
Can I make a quick comment? I mean, I had when they were working on the chapter of the international planning education, I had given this example that time. When I was at Newcastle University, there is an undergraduate planning course on understanding sustainable development. So I was working for that course as a seminar leader or something like this. I mean, not in a teaching capacity, but as a teaching support thing. So the material I had looked into at that point, it doesn't use the word international anywhere, but there were cases, many cases that were drawing examples from Global South. They were interdisciplinary, so not just based on built environment, but in an interdisciplinary way. And there were also cases which was looking into migration related to climate change, food insecurity due to climate change. But the name of the course was Understanding Sustainable Development. It was neither on international planning, it was nor on climate change. And most of the students, they were actually from UK. So there are not too many international students. So I thought that was a great example of how these programs, or I don't know, I mean, I'm probably not aware of all the courses, but for specifically this one, and we used to, I was conducting debate between two groups, and they were actually equipped with all those knowledge that is happening in Global South countries in terms of climate change, in terms of development, in terms of migration, climate change related migration. So that is, I thought that was a great example. And yeah, sorry.
Sure, please.
I also had a comment to make on this, on the question of this, how we are teaching climate change and development in the Global South. So informality is not just like slum upgradation or displacement. India's 90% jobs are in informal sector. So informality is being taught in planning programs in an integrated way, not now, from a long time back. Climate change is comparatively new, and I'm not very sure whether this has been, I imagine this has been made mandatory courses now, but that might not be applicable to all the institutes. But I think what is also important, instead of having a separate course as climate change, which is also important, because in climate change, there are risks and uncertainties. When you are dealing with risk and uncertainties, when you are thinking about applying, how do you address climate change in planning? And planning is an applied science field, so you have to use the knowledge from natural science. That part is, I think that part is important. But also teaching climate change in other mandatory courses. There was a course on economics for planners, and there are certain ways in which climate change affect the economy. So what I'm trying to say is, it is important to have a standalone course on climate change, but it's also important to integrate the component of climate change in all the other main curriculum courses. Because this is what, of course, budding planners, this is what they will actually have to deal with on the ground.
So you would say that it's a bit a combination of the importance, on one hand, the importance of having specific courses on the topic, and on the other hand, to make it cross-cutting,
more integrated into the curriculum.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree with that. Totally agree. That is a very important. Well, the way we, I think it's impossible in 2023. It should be to give a responsible education and in planning without having always in mind undermining the climate change and, well, in particular the need of climate adaptation to the climate change as a result of the being aware of the climate change. Definitely. I make me think it was very interesting your experience about the sustainable development course that you are running and the predominance of English students. I wonder if the name of the course would be another, the audience would also change. You have any similar experience? If it would be Global South development, do you think the audience would change? You don't know, but maybe, do you know any examples in which that would be?
No.
Because it's a quite a nice and neutral
Yeah, yeah.
title for a course.
Yeah, what you are telling makes sense. So if the name of the course is Global South, then probably not all the British students will be taking that course. Although it was a mandatory course, but I mean, the course was really on sustainable development. They also had cases from the north, and they also had cases from the south. And that was a reflection of, I think, the faculties, they were carrying out research in the south. So, and also on the various topic. And there are certain programs which are very much focused on built environment. I think when it comes to climate change, it's important to make it more interdisciplinary. And this is what was the case for the course. Yeah.
And it seems a very good move in terms of diluting the borders between Global South and Global North.
Yeah. That's true. Do we have more questions? Bruce, do you want to conclude? Do you have a final remark?
I'm sorry?
Do you have a final remark?
Do I have a final remark? Well, I think it's wonderful to have this conversation. And I think Paulo has pulled together some really on point studies that have been done and perspectives. And, you know, clearly the group here is motivated by these concerns and working on it. We have a long way to go. And this was an important step forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Paulo, very much.